15 minutes behind schedule. That's not terrible. What? I was trying to. Right. Well, I was going to say, the only reason it wouldn't be is if we did it, I should say, if we did it beforehand, we'd really have a captive audience, but also a hangry audience. This is better. Much better. What? I'd be happy to ask. Well, are you going over and visit? I would like to try. All right. I will make a ask. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Right. Like that's not what you're looking for. Not yet. We'll do that soon. Oh, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. First off, I like this so much better than the sermon because it gives me a chance to try my TED Talk out on you. So it'll be a lot of fun. But I also want to thank everybody for being here tonight. This idea came about actually, wasn't my own. It was her, right over there. It was Susan. I know, well. But what happened was that last year I started to do a couple of scholar-in-residence programs, which I'm also going to be doing again for a synagogue in Baltimore in January. And I was doing scholar-in-residence programs on some of my work regarding interfaith families. And Susan was like, well, you're our rabbi. We want to hear it. So you should bring it here. So we had this whole idea of doing a scholar-in-residence weekend until we realized, yeah, isn't it kind of like every week when you come, you got a Friday night thing, you got a Shabbat morning thing, and then a Sunday thing? It's like always happening. So what's going to be that different? So that's where we came upon this idea to be able to have certain sessions that are more of a scholar-in-residence variety. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And to be able to share some of this work with all of you, which is my wonderful community. And I really want to thank Susan and Andy and Michael and of all of our leadership that allowed this opportunity to happen, for me to bring what I call the Torah of interfaithing, what every Jewish community needs to know about how Jewish wisdom encourages interfaith families to embrace all of their culture, heritage, and practice in their homes, to be able to bring this here to all of you. So I want to thank you for that opportunity. And as so many of you know, that this year has been a pretty important year for me in terms of my own movement into forward with this work. And I want to thank the community who you've been so incredibly supportive. There are plenty of rabbis who do not have the kind of support that you have given to my work regarding interfaith families. I just want to thank each and every one of you for that. So when it comes to the scholar-in-residence program, or what it generally looks like, is you bring somebody out for a weekend. It costs a certain amount of money, and so you want to be able to really drum up excitement, engagement among the entire community. And I love coming here so much every single time, and it feels in many ways like that kind of scholar-in-residence weekend, where we have a chance to really learn together. But when it comes to thinking about why a congregation would want to bring somebody in from the outside, is that there's a certain perspective, a certain set of teachings, learnings that's valuable for the congregation to be able to raise awareness of, or to just learn more about. My dad for many years has brought in a scholar on the Indian Jewish community. Wherever he goes, he always brings her in, and it's a really fascinating conversation and learning. It could be about any topic, from theology to Israel, whatever the situation may be, that's really relevant in the minds of the particular Jewish community. Interfaith families and how synagogues welcome interfaith families is a really important topic that many congregations are considering and are working on and are thinking about. And so this topic is not just something that's important to me, but it's important for many other congregations and many other communities out there, which is why I think that this Torah is so important to be able to share. In addition, one of the things that often happens in scholar-in-residence weekends is that you have these different programs. The first evening is usually this on a Friday night. Talk about, here's like the main thing that I want to talk about over the course of the larger weekend. Here's the main ideas, and let's kind of get it started. And then it kind of shifts over the course of time to whether it's smaller groups for a particular demographic of the congregation on that topic, and also a chance for you to meet the donors who make it happen. Because every program in a shul takes money. And it takes those who really want to be able to support the congregation by bringing somebody in, because that's money in addition to whatever they give for the upkeep of the congregation. So while you already pay me to get here, that's not what I'm mostly going to be referencing, but instead that our congregation is engaged in a project to ensure that we are here for the long term. Our capital campaign, it's done to burn the mortgage, to make sure that we are here for good
in East Greenwich in this beautiful home. So I would like to encourage all of you, if you haven't yet already, to think about a gift to the congregation in honor of a moment like this, to say, here is Judaism really coming alive. Here is Judaism really being meaningful in this part of Rhode Island, and we want to invest in that work. Just as I would to thank all the donors for allowing me to be able to come out, I want to thank all of you for allowing me to be able to be here today and to encourage you to continue to give to this wonderful institution, this wonderful organization, so that we may go from generation to generation here, may we go from year to year with a sense of pride in who we are as this East Greenwich Torat Yisrael. Can I get an amen? Amen. I'm not going to go all gospel on you, I promise. But yeah, maybe a little bit. All right. I want to start with a story. In many ways, it's kind of like a four-part story, because there are four main characters. There is the pious one, the leader, the teacher, and the communicator. And each one of them has their own particular story that I want to share with you. But at the same time, I think in many ways, you could imagine them each representing different stages of an individual's life, as well as of the Jewish community's experience in dealing with living in this world that we call home. So I'm going to start with who I would like to call Avramelech the Pious. Who is Avramelech? Avramelech was a young boy who was sitting on his father's lap, and his father was telling him a story about how his great-great-grandfather was one of the followers of the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, a Hasidic master, somebody who really loved his Judaism and wore it on his sleeve. And he was the man who said that in everything that God created, there is a holy spark. And your job is to try to find that hidden spark. A little of Ramaleh's great-great-grandfather was one of the followers who was able to find that spark, who was able to see it in every blade of grass. And so Ramaleh's father said to him, don't open your eyes to find that hidden spark. It's to open your heart, to be able to feel it and sense it wherever it may be. Because every generation needs you, Avramelech. Needs an Avramelech like your great-great-grandfather, who you're named after, to be able to find those hidden sparks. And this individual by the name of Avramelech, he also went by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. Now, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel was a profound Jewish theologian, born in what we would call today modern-day Poland. And in this particular story of his upbringing, he was meant to become a Hasidic master. He was meant to become somebody who was going to lead a generation of Hasidim, just like his father, his grandfather, his great-great-grandfather. But he was also a curious sort. And one day he went to the library and he started reading books in Polish and not in Hebrew. Art, philosophy, poetry. One night his mother found him with a Hebrew book open, but Avramelech, little Avramelech, he was speaking Polish because he was actually reading Polish in the book that Hebrew was hiding. Most of our kids do the opposite, right? But here, this little boy was not studying his Torah. And his mother, Rivka, was very, very concerned and said, well, we have to talk. Because it seems like you are going to forget your Jewishness. It seems like you're going to forget what it means to be a Jew in order to enter the wider world. And little Avramelech actually said to his mom at that time, Mama, I love the Torah and the teachings of the Hasidic masters, but I need more. I want to study art, math, poetry, and philosophy. And that's what Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel did. He studied all those, and he became one of the greatest teachers, not just of his generation, but of this moment right now that we are living in. Because if it wasn't for him, there is a good chance that we would not be able to get along as we do right now with our fellow Americans. I'm going to give you a handout that I'm going to ask you to only start with the first page and then to not look at the rest of it, which is a very dangerous thing to do. Probably not going to happen, but that's okay. So there are many different kinds of stories of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel I could talk about. There is a story of him marching with Martin Luther King Jr., of saying, I am praying with my feet. There is of him being a voice against the Vietnam War because he did not believe it to be a moral engagement. It could be about him being one of the greatest theology teachers that there ever existed during the 20th century. We're going to touch a little bit on that. But most of all, for these purposes, the story of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel that we need to talk about is the fact that during his lifetime, particularly when he got older, and he was able to establish himself as a theologian in the larger American context, that he was able to sit on a committee that was to determine the future of Jewish-Catholic relationships forever. See, after the Holocaust, the Catholic Church realized that many of their teachings were used as justifications for the killing of 6 million Jews. And so decided that they needed to find a rapprochement with the Jewish community and to be able to work on some of the main issues that separated the two communities together. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, as a theologian, was very important to sit in this moment as a representative of the American Jewish community because the disagreements between Judaism and Catholicism are primarily theological. I want to say that again. The disagreements between Judaism and Catholicism are primarily theological. And I'll put it to you in another way. When I had a bat mitzvah in my last congregation, and she also went to Catholic school, to CCD, at the same time as studying to become a bat mitzvah. It was the only time that my executive committee ever cared about Jewish theology. They said to me, how could a Jew become a bat mitzvah if they also believe in Jesus? It's the only time that we talk about these things in terms of our relationships with other faith traditions is particularly in this context because we have so made the separation between us and Christians, or particularly Catholics, around the lens of belief in Jesus. But it's actually the other way around. That is to say that the main issue that Catholicism faced wasn't necessarily that Jews do not believe in Jesus. It's rather, if they don't believe in Jesus, does their religion matter anymore? And that was the essential question that needed to be answered in order for there to be a rapprochement between these two different communities. This is what you have on your page. So, I have this one. Okay. In 1961, Heschel made a recommendation to the council to improve Catholic-Jewish relations, and he offered these 3 particular recommendations. Number 1, urge the council to reject and condemn those who assert that the Jews as a people are responsible for the crucifixion. Number 2, suggested that the council acknowledge the integrity and permanent preciousness of the Jews and Judaism so that the Jews be accepted as Jews. This meant that the church would reconsider its missionary attitude and refrained from regarding Jews primarily as potential converts. And third, it called for programs to eliminate abuses and derogatory stereotypes by promoting scholarly cooperation and the creation of church agencies to combat religious prejudice. I want to put these three things out here. And before we get to any of your thoughts on it, and I do want to get some of your thoughts on it before we move on, I want to call your attention to the very third point. The programs designed to eliminate abuses and derogatory stereotypes is to be promoted by scholarly cooperation. I would argue that scholarly cooperation is a form of assimilation. It's a form of assimilation. And here's where we get to the complex history of assimilation in regards to Heschel, to Avramala's story. He was sitting on his father's lap being talked about, or in which he was hearing this idea of there being sparks of holiness found in everything. That notion of the sparks being found in everything really means everything. Every blade of grass and every faith tradition. Well, what it also means is that if you are going to find those sparks in everything, you not only have to be versed in everything, but you have to be willing to say that all of those things are worthwhile for me to learn. Much of the questions around assimilation from a negative view, and we are going to get to the negative view a little bit later, is the fact that through that kind of assimilation of different ideas, we are acknowledging the fact that those ideas are good and that they are going to influence us. Are we willing? Do we want to have certain ideas from the outside, not from our world, whatever we define as our world, influence the ways in which we do things? That's part of what this is all about. Are we willing to accept the influence of another? So, with that in mind, I'm curious if any of you have thoughts on one of these three bullet points in terms of what Heschel was recommending. They adopted some of them, but not all of them. One of the main ones it adopted was to condemn those who assert that the Jews as a people are responsible for the crucifixion. If you go to the church's official documentation now, no longer are the Jews responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Whether they're teaching it or not in certain schools, that depends on the local school and what that may be, which comes back to this being an issue. One of the stories that I shared on my podcast, Interfaithing, was about a Jewish woman. She grew up in a Jewish Catholic household. They were raised as Jews, but they went to all of the Catholic things. It was part of her mom's family. She actually found it more, it was easier for her to go to, what's it called? It's here in Providence, the Catholic school in Providence. I forgot the name of it. Not LaSalle. No, we're probably just going to play this game for over. What? That's it. Providence College. So she went to Providence College as opposed to Brandeis because she was like, I'm tired of all the Jews there. And it was more comfortable for her in that New England setting to be around fellow Catholics, to be around Catholics in the school until it was, again, in this university setting when one of the Catholic leaders got up in front of the class and said, and that's when our brothers and sisters from the Jewish faith killed Jesus. And that's when she said, excuse me, not the case. And that led her actually on her path towards fully identifying as a Jew. How could she sit back and let someone tell her about who she was? And in that regard, a split happened between her and a Catholic upbringing that was a part of who she was, even though she did not fully identify with. At this point, no more identification at all. What? Yeah. It was a council specifically designed to get views from the Jewish community on how the church could be able to make better relations with the Jewish community as a whole. And in that, they were going to be making recommendations to the Holy See. This was 61, yeah. That's a part of this I do not necessarily know, so happy to talk about that separately. But I want you, if you can, I want you to turn for a moment to something that is really powerful here, which if you turn to page 2. Because in a certain sense, what Heschel does here is something that I've never seen before. And it speaks to the sense of assimilation on a scholarly level in which you are being able to come together with another tradition and say, we are in this fight together in a way that probably up until this point no one ever thought of before. Look at the third paragraph that says Nazism. Nazism in its very roots was a rebellion against the Bible, against the God of Abraham. Realizing that it was Christianity that implanted attachment to the God of Abraham and involvement with the Hebrew Bible in the hearts of Western man, Nazism resolved that it must both exterminate the Jews and eliminate Christianity and bring about instead a revival of Teutonic paganism. By the way, what that really means is to say this movement by the Nazis wasn't done just against the Jews, it was against the mission of Christians as well. Their Christian anti-Semitism that existed in Germany were forms of anti-Semitism, looking at the ways in which Jews have always been seen as money grubbers, as people who don't believe in the rules of society. All of those negative stereotypes. But its core was the same thing that the Christians were fighting for, which is to make the world follow the language and the notion of what the Hebrew Bible is trying to teach us. Nazism has suffered a defeat, but the process of eliminating the Bible from the consciousness of the Western world goes on. It is on the issue of saving the radiance of the Hebrew Bible in the minds of man that Jews and Christians are called upon to work together. The vital challenge for the church is to decide whether Christianity came to overcome, to abolish, or to continue the Jewish way by bringing the God of Abraham and his will to the Gentiles. Notice that language. Are you here to replace us? Are you here to undermine us? Or are we in this together? None of us can do it alone. Both of us must realize that in our age, anti-Semitism is anti-Christianity, and anti-Christianity is anti-Semitism. Energies, experiences, and ideas that come to life outside the boundaries of a particular religion or all religions continue to challenge and to affect every religion. No religion is an island. The language here, in a very kind of theological approach, not talking about it in terms of people, not talking about it even in terms of peace, but talking about it in terms of what is your mission as a religion. He is giving Christianity a leg up to say, we Jews respect what you do. We Jews accept what you do as something that is valuable for the world. That can only come through engagement together with Christians. By the way, if you take a look even as far back as Maimonides talks about in an interestingly, it's a section of his Mishnah Torah, which is his magnum opus on all the different laws of Torah. But it's in a section that is, at some points in history, it's actually edited out, I think mostly by Jews and by Christians. But in this section, he says that Muslims and Christians are also doing the same job as we are. And in fact, they're spreading the message of God further than we could. Because part of their mission is through conversion, and that is not something that is there for us. And so what they're doing, we're all a part of the same project. This idea, by the way, that the fact that Christianity especially could also be based on a foundation of understanding, of learning, in which you're able to fully accept the other for their points of view, comes from engagement not just on a theological level, but on a deeply personal level. There's one particular medieval rabbi by the name of Menachem HaMeiri, who probably would not consider this to be a social thing that he was doing, but I think it is, because any good rabbi knows when you get somebody together to learn together, it's a social engagement. You're checking in, how's your mom? Is they at the hospital? How are things going? You get to know people. He was engaged in a project of learning together in a charuta, in a learning scenario with some Christian ministers. And it was through that engagement that he's basically said, Umot gedurot bechol hadatot, maskimim be'elohut. That there are nations who believe in the same moral precepts, who are law-abiding. Those are good people. And they're people who believe in the unity of God. They just do it differently. I think at the core, what Heschel is saying is that notion that there is good in everything, that there are these sparks to find, and that we can be able to raise them up. So that the complex history of assimilation for us as Jews is, do we simply feel that we need to separate ourselves from the larger world in order to protect what is Jewish? Or is what Heschel doing making Judaism come alive by engaging with the wider world? Okay. That's story number one. Story number two. We're going to talk about the leader. This was a man I started the story of Avramelech. He was when he was very, very young. I'm going to start this one of Shlomo the leader. Shlomo was somebody in his teens who was starting to learn. He was always learning from his Rebbeim out in Eastern Europe. And at that same time, he was also learning a lot of Hebrew. And through his Hebrew newspaper, he read of a man by the name of President Abraham Lincoln. And in little Shlomo's understanding of Abraham Lincoln, in reading more about him, he started to think, this man seems like a good Jewish leader. First, he had read that Abraham Lincoln was a wood chopper, which was prose for rail splitter, because he worked on the rails back home in Illinois. How did I forget Illinois? Sorry, I forgot the penny now. And as it turns out, that there is a character in the Torah in rabbinic literature by the name of Hillel. Hillel also was a wood chopper. And so he said, in that sense, he seemed to recognize the President of the United States as a new Hillel, because the legend describes that Hillel as engaged in the same occupation before he was called by his people to the dignity of becoming the patriarch of the Jewish Sanhedrin. In addition, he had read the remarks from President Lincoln's 4th of March inaugural, which he said that final line of that inaugural seemed to conclude like a hymn. We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot patriot grave to every living heart and heartstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Shlomo also seemed to recognize the sense that this man had a good rabbinic sense of humor about him. There is the story given of a general in the Union Army who was claimed that he was always drunk with whiskey. And Lincoln's response to that was, well, what brand of whiskey is it so I can distribute it among the other generals? Well, it turns out there's a kind of a similar story in the Talmudic literature, in rabbinic literature, that there was a pious man who saw a drunken man in the gutter, and he brought his father to see him because his father was an addict to drink, to see the man and to say, see, this is what you're going to become. You know what the first thing his father said to the drunken man? What's the address of the inn where you got such good wine? This man who I call Shlomo is a leader. His name, Dr. Rabbi Solomon Schechter. Dr. Schechter, who grew up in Romania, then moved to England, eventually found his home in America, the early part of the 20th century. And he became the leader, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, the institution which ordained me as a rabbi. I also forgot to mention, but it is on here, that Rabbi Heschel was a professor of theology at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America for many years. When he got here to America, his job as he saw it was to be able to help create an American Judaism that was the form of a union. Can somebody tell me what is the name of the Union of Conservative Synagogues called? What was the acronym? The USY is the youth part. USCJ. United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. It was originally the United Synagogue of America. That was Schechter's idea. He wanted to be like Lincoln and to bring everybody together, to hold everyone together, all of the different kinds of Jews that were around, from the German Jews who arrived in the middle of the 19th century, who definitely assimilated in the sense of becoming even more deeply Americanized and saying we need to become fully immersed in this larger culture that we're a part of, to the early 20th century Eastern European Jews who were trying to figure out, where the heck am I? This isn't Hungary, this isn't Lithuania, this isn't Poland. And at that time, all the Hungarian Jews, they didn't talk to the Poles didn't talk to the Lithuanians, they had their different shuls. There was no sense of unity. And Schechter came here to finally bring everyone together. His story, in a certain sense, I think, also represents that notion of a complex history of assimilation. Because, as I started, he had this affinity understanding of America through his first engagement with Lincoln and what he read. And yet, also in coming from Eastern Europe, in coming from a world of deep religious sensibility, trying to make it work in America. By the way, he wanted to call JTS, or what do you call JTS? The Jewish Harvard. That's the idea. Where there would be deep scholarship, real deep engagement of Judaism, bringing the best of the world out there to the best of Judaism and making it all work. Well, he had some certain thoughts about whether or not that was going to be possible in the world that he had come into the early part of the 20th century. Take a look at page 3. His thoughts on assimilation. What I understand by assimilation is loss of identity, or that process of disintegration which, passing through various degrees of defiance of all Jewish thought and of disloyalty to Israel's history and its mission, terminates variously in different lands, where the pressure from above in favor of the dominant religion is very strong, has been removed. It results in the severance of all affiliation with the synagogue. Translation, nobody is joining the shul. Nobody's coming to services. They're out doing the American thing. They're out going to a movie. They're at home watching Netflix. So there was definitely no Netflix back then. They're not engaged. And slowly but surely, that life was disintegrating. Talked about that story before, about the notion of the candles going up and the candles going down. It's almost as if the candles were on its way down. The best is behind us. Our future is going to look bleak. It gets kind of even worse. If you continue down into the middle, into the last little line, it is this kind of assimilation with the terrible consequences indicated that I dread most, even more than the pogroms. Now, he was speaking in 1909. So this is before the Holocaust. Pogroms is the worst kind of thing you could say. Because there, Jews are being killed for the sake of being Jews. And he's saying assimilation is going to destroy us. Because it's not that we're learning good other things. Yes, we're learning good other things, but we're forgetting all the good things that we have in our Judaism. That's his fear of assimilation. What do you think? Do you agree with Schefter's understanding of assimilation here? No. Say more. Say again?
Great thought, but never happened. You understand how people behave.
Okay. Anyone else? Because what I'll say is that this particular statement that he made, what I did with this is I took different sources and put them a little bit together. I gave you kind of citations of where you can generally find them, but they're not always put together in the same exact way here. This comes from his statement on Zionism. He uses assimilation here to talk about that the job of Zionism is to be a bulwark against this assimilation. That Zionism will not allow us as a people to wither and die out in the rest of the world because we have a nation and a state that will protect our Judaism from the infiltration of all of those other ideas. Yeah.
I think history has shown he was exactly right. That the more we assimilate, the more we get exposed to the American way and the less we are concerned about Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
The conservative movement is unfortunately atrophied.
Mm-hmm.
Orthodoxy is still pretty strong. The Reform movement is still gangbusters, but the conservative movement is synagogues are closing.
Mm-hmm.
They're consolidating, they're closing, they're disappearing.
Right.
So I would say he was exactly right. And it's going to get worse. And in 100 years, how many conservative synagogues will there still be?
Fair enough. Thank you, Mark. Any final thought on this?
So sure that it isn't the fact that this society failed more traditional patterns.
I will tell you something, though, that I find interesting. I said this to a number of folks that I'm teaching a few college courses at Stockton University, which is a university in New Jersey, teaching them online. And as part of the work I do, I ask them an opening question. Really is to make sure that they're on Zoom, that I can see their faces, that they can actually speak over Zoom. So it's like, let me hear your voice. It's okay, I can hear you. The question I just asked this past week, because I'm teaching about Israel-Palestine, and I was talking about the peace process from the early 1990s. I said, what gives you hope? You have no idea how many of them, 18, 19-year-olds, black, white, Hispanic. No idea how many of them said, what gives me hope is my faith, is my religion, is God. Could be. Fair enough. Could be self-selecting. But here's the thing. America is the most secular, religious country in the world. If you take a look at other Enlightenment-centered countries, and what I mean by that is think back to the American Revolution, and think back to how we were supposed to fight for the right of everybody to have free liberty and conscience of spirit, that we are here as individuals, and individual freedom is most important. It was also big in France, eventually got its way to Germany. Much of Europe is no longer religious, even though religion was massive there. It's still big here. And even in New England, and we talked about this in one of my other classes, on Sunday, which you're all welcome to come to, is how the foundation of American education, the public school system, Thanksgiving, which was instituted by Dr. Schechter's favorite president, was centered in religion. It was centered in a sense of faith in God. And just to show you that, prepare that for you tonight, take a look at the bottom, from the bottom of page 3 into 4. The half century that has well nigh elapsed since his death has dispelled the mists that encompassed him on earth. Wish we could only speak like this. Men now not only recognize the right which he championed, but behold him in the standard of righteousness, of liberty, of conciliation, and truth. In him, as it were personified, the union, all that is best and noblest and enduring in its principles, in which he devoutly believed and strove mightily to save. When today the world celebrates the century of his existence, he has become the ideal of both North and South, of a common country, composed not only of the factions that once confronted each other in war's dreadful array, but of the myriad thousands that have since found in the American nation the hope of the future and the refuge from the age-entrenched wrong and absolution. To them, Lincoln, his life, his history, his character, his entire personality with all its wondrous charm and grace, its sobriety, patience, self-abnegation, sweetness, has come to be the very prototype of a rising humanity. This does not sound like it's written from a man who believes that the candles are slowly being eliminated and it's getting darker, but that there's a hope for a brighter future. There's a hope for a brighter future here, in this union. When we're talking about assimilation, I think it's important to consider the context in which we are in, the unique American context that we are a part of. That in many ways, the ways in which interfaith families live with each other, trying to figure out how to be able to make religion work, is not necessarily seen in other countries where there is mixed marriages of different sorts. And a part of that is because of the foundation of our country for the respect of religion. I want to get to my third story, though. Yes? You got me, because I'm going to get to that right now. Here's what I'd like us to do. I want to tell you the third story. This comes from Gershon the teacher. Gershon the teacher grew up going to a good Jewish summer camp. Loved Israel and Hebrew. Eventually found his way to JTS and became a student. Became a rabbi. And loved Jewish history. And loved being able to teach how Judaism was always different in its unique contexts, and how Judaism always responded to those particular contexts. This man, his name is Rabbi or Dr. Gershon D. Cohen, who was chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary from 1972 to 1985. Page 5. I got the dates mixed up. It was 1992. 1992 is when he passed away. That's amazing. So, Dr. Cohen in 1977, that's 1977, I'm sorry. Yeah, 1977, he gave the commencement speech for rabbis. The name of his commencement speech was The Blessing of Assimilation. A frank appraisal of the periods in which Judaism flourished will indicate that not only did a certain amount of assimilation and acculturation not impede Jewish continuity and creativity, but that in a profound sense, this assimilation and acculturation was a stimulus to original thinking and expression. Here are some interesting examples to be able to give. Anybody know who's the one who saved all of us from Pharaoh? Moses. Who was his brother? Did you know that those names are actually Egyptian names? Egyptian names. Which speaks to a particular text that Gershon Cohen reflects on in his article, in his speech of the Blessing of Assimilation, that according to a couple of Talmudic scholars, of Talmudic rabbis, one of the name is Bar Kapara, that owing to 4 factors were the people of Israel redeemed from the land of Egypt. They did not alter their names, they did not change their language, they did not spread malicious gossip, and they did not change their clothes. Not literally. They changed their clothes when they were out in the field, but more that they did not change their dress to fit others. You know, wearing something like this. Right? They did not change their dress. Well, in terms of the names, Aaron, Moses were good Egyptian names. Daniel, that appears in the Bible, that is a Semitic name that's not a Jewish name. Also, we're celebrating here the story of the Maccabees fighting against the Greeks. That's almost imagining a fight against assimilation because the Greeks were assimilating everybody together. Well, you know who were the 2 individuals who, after the Maccabees were victorious over Greece, the 2 Jews that Judah sent to Rome to represent the people? Their names were Jason and Eupolemus. Definitely Greek-oriented. Of course we have many names. Of course we have the names that we use no matter where we live, and that those names reflect whether it's certain values, but also they reflect the culture that we live in, and who it is that we want to honor, and who it is that is part of our larger extended family or cultural network. We do change our names. We do have multiple names. It's not just the Hebrew name. And in fact, he gives an example how, very much like ourselves, there was an individual who in Hebrew documents wrote Menachem, and in Greek ones wrote Peregoris. It's just like when you're called up here by your Hebrew name for an aliyah, but then you go out to work and you're called by your English name, or, if you want to be technical, your Christian name. So here we have, in our particular cultural context, something that is actually traceable all the way to 2nd century of the Common Era, to the way Jews lived. Go back to the page. Throughout Jewish history, there have been great changes in law and thought and in basic categories of expression, reflecting the need of the Jews to adapt themselves and their way of life to new conditions. This assimilation or adaptation was not the consequence of a desire to make things easier, but the result of a need to continue to make the tradition relevant. So, I have not been at the Cranford Synagogue, at the Cranford Sanctuary. I'm sorry, Cranston. Cranford's in New Jersey. Sorry for getting it wrong. But I'm not mistaken, there was not a piano, the other word. Organ. Correct? Organs were introduced in churches to make the service more musical. So, if you're going to make it more musical, we want to make it more musical. So let's do it. That was my shul back in Perth Amboy, my very first shul. I loved the sanctuary. It was beautiful. The organ never worked because it was old. But still, I heard stories from members who loved the organ and how much it made the service come alive. Now, it doesn't make it come alive for everybody. I'm sure we have a lot of different opinions about what an organ would be like in a shul. And I'm not introducing it now. I'm just telling you now. I'm not trying to reintroduce it at all. But take a look out here at this beautiful sanctuary that we have. We're really going to say that this sanctuary is not influenced in some manner by all of the other religious institutions? Yes, Jewish, but probably not just Jewish. They're around us. They want to be engaged in nature. They want to see God in all of those blades of grass, that spark that exists in all creatures, in all things. Just because something doesn't come from your tradition, it doesn't make it wrong or bad. In fact, it can make it even more beautiful. But the point that Cohen is saying is not that that is an exception to the rule when it comes to Jewish life. It is very much a part of the secret sauce that makes Judaism work. Is the fact that we live in particular contexts. That Maimonides spoke Arabic, was a physician to the Sultan where he was living. He looked like a Muslim because that's what you were. It wasn't this is what Muslims wear, it's what you wear when you go out into public. And the fact that he views this as part of what it means to be Jewish, I think teaches us a little bit about what Jewish history has really been like ever since the previous time we had sovereignty in the land when the Second Temple was destroyed in 70 CE. We haven't just, we've gotten through the past 2,000 years. No, we've thrived. We've been able to not just make it work, we've been able to do amazing things as a people. Back in the third paragraph. The great and to a considerable extent salutary transformations that overtook the Jews during the 19th and 20th centuries have likewise been in large measure the products of assimilation. The rebirth of Hebrew, the growth of jüdische Wissenschaft, which is a fancy German word for the scientific study of Judaism, i.e., making JTS the Jewish Harvard. The liberalization of the Jewish religion, the acceptance of Yiddish as a respectable vehicle of Jewish literary expression. And he says that, by the way, because Yiddish originally really was German. It's principally German, with just some Hebrew characters kind of thrown in. And now that is an actual way of engaging in Jewish engagement. The growth of Jewish nationalism and the state of Israel. Compare that, by the way, for a second here. Schechter, in an article about Zionism, said that Zionism is a bulwark against assimilation. Cohen here is saying that the state of Israel, that Zionism is a product of assimilation. There's a whole conversation there about how Israel and the state of Israel came to be, and to what extent is the state of Israel and Zionism as a whole a product of our experience as Jews living in the wider world, or us shunning the wider world. All the great changes and developments that characterize modern Jewish history and that have made the lives of countless Jews infinitely richer and more pleasant than they had ever previously been are the effects of assimilation. Assimilation properly channeled and exploited can become a blessing. The great ages of Jewish creativity were born out of a response to the challenge of assimilation. And there's no reason why our age should not respond to this challenge with equal vigor. This was a teacher, somebody who said, when you find your students, meet them where they are, teach them in the way they need to be taught. And finally, make it relevant for them so they'll be able to continue that tradition into the next generation. One final story for you. This one is not affiliated with the Jewish Theological Seminary, but the story of Susan the Communicator, I will say, is a story that in many ways reflects both of the challenge of assimilation that was being experienced, that Cohen was referring to, that Schechter was afraid of, and that Heschel in many ways was dealing with, which is what happens when you get Jews and Christians to not only work together, to not only learn together, but to love together and to build families together. And her story, in many ways, represents this deeper idea, this idea to communicate, to pass on your heritage from one generation to the next, and to do so with joy, creativity, inspiration, defying spirituality, and love. The story of Susan the Communicator is that she was born to a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. In fact, to a Protestant mother. And when she was a baby, her mother, her grandmother, and her aunt secretly baptized her. All secretly baptized her to offer more protection, is what they said. But they did not exactly know that each one was doing it. More doing it in hiding than anything else, because for the father, who grew up in a conservative Jewish household, that of course we're only going to be raising our children as Jews because that's how it's going to be. And at this time of her, and when she was first living in the early 60s, there really was no option for there to be sharing of multiple traditions. You kind of really had to choose just one, with the other one being often put to the side. Her story of her interfaith journey, which is the subject of her book, Being Both, which I would recommend to everyone if you're interested in this subject, starts as follows on page 7. As a teenager, I felt solely and completely Jewish. In part, this was a tribute to my parents' united front on our religious identity. On the high holy days in the fall, I was eager to spend long hours in the synagogue with my father, while my mother often attended one service with the younger children and then stayed home taking care of them. When I fasted with my father on Yom Kippur, I experienced how the lightheadedness caused by an empty stomach, coupled with chanting and praying, could bring about an interesting alteration in consciousness, a sense of transcendence. At the same time, I understood Judaism as being particularly compatible with modern scientific thought. I believed that the simplicity and rationality of Jewish technology had somehow inspired the multitude of great Jewish scientists. All in all, I felt lucky to be born into a religion that was spiritually, aesthetically, and intellectually satisfying. Up until now, I think if you were talking to Heschel, Schechter, to Cohen, they'd say, it's a good Jew here. It was only when I began to enter that adult world that I started to encounter over external resistance to my self-identification as a Jew. Because remember, her father was a Jew, her mother was not, and therefore, according to halakha, she is not a Jew. Despite the Hebrew, that bat mitzvah, and all of my mother's sacrifices, because she never converted and yet raised a Jewish child, I began to meet people who told me that I simply wasn't Jewish. I I remember a date with a pre-med student, a conservative Jew from New York. Apparently, he thought having dinner with me was rebellious. You're not Jewish, he informed me. My parents would rather have me marry a falasha, an offensive term for an Ethiopian Jew, a black Jew, really, than marry you. There was no second date. The racism inherent in his declaration only struck me later. At the time, I was busy being stunned by the rejection. Alienated from what had begun to feel like an insular and exclusionary Judaism, I was eager as a young adult to explore other worldviews. I'm going to pause here, actually, because how does that strike you, that shift in her story? For her, her path of Judaism was, I am a child of assimilation. I am a child of living in this world where my parents come from different traditions, and together in this moment they made a decision that was right for them and for their family to raise me as a Jew, and I was proud to be a Jew until Judaism rejected me. In a sense, it was the opposite of the story I shared earlier of a woman who was raised as a Jew and then told by a Catholic priest that, oh, Jews kill Jesus. And that told her to go more in the direction of her Judaism. I would expect, in a certain sense, that Susan would turn away from her Judaism. Because at the very least, what is happening here is disregarding Heschel's advice of finding the sparks in all. At the very least, it is saying that Schechter's fear that assimilation is going to mean that you're not going to be involved in your Judaism at all isn't true. Isn't true. And especially when it comes to Gershon Cohen, that they're saying this is not okay for Jews to do. We're not okay to intermarry. We're not okay to engage in relationships one with the other in this kind of a manner. Which, by the way, we have evidence from 2nd century Babylonia that there was intermarriage in Babylonia. Not 2nd century, I'm sorry, even earlier. 586 before the Common Era, that there was intermarriage in Babylonia. And in fact, if you take a look at some of the text from that period of time that we have in our Bible, from Ezra and Nehemiah, they were sent back from Babylonia, or then it was Persia, to go live in the land of Israel. And it was only there that they said, no intermarriage. Because only there they could control it. They could not control it in Persia or Babylonia. Because that's the thing when it comes to living in the wider world, with assimilation. We can't control what a community does. You're not in charge. Everyone's responsible for themselves, and there is a wider world to be part of. But what is amazing is that if we are open and welcoming to the blessings of that wider world, there is so much that that wider world could teach us and hopefully helps us return back to our Judaism. Coming back to the peach. Alienated from what had begun to feel like an insular exclusionary Judaism, I was eager as a young adult to explore other worldviews. As fate would have it, in high school I met Paul Miller, an Episcopalian with a truly global spirit. By the time we got married, Paul had already lived in 2 Catholic countries and 1 Muslim country. Paul feels most alive when immersed in other cultures, speaking other languages, discovering new ways of being in the world. And our family joke is that, stranded as a teenager in New England, he gravitated to the most exotic woman he could find, a half-Jew. When we married, my chivalrous husband, the great-grandson of an Episcopal bishop, offered that he would be willing to raise our children as Jews. I was the one who could not imagine trying to shield my children from the Christian reality of 3/4 of their family tree. Because her mom, not Jewish. His parents, both not Jewish. Only her father was Jewish. I don't want to shut them off from a part of the world that they're a part of. That's like saying to Heschel, put the Polish away. That's like saying to Schechter, don't read Lincoln. That's That's like saying to Gershon Cohen, what you believe is Jewish history did not exist. Living in this world, the world in which we are in, is not a choice. It is a gift if we decide it's a gift, and it's a curse if we decide that it is a curse. But it just is. It's more of a question of how do we take it? How do we think about the world in which we're in and the choices that we have? At the same time, I did not necessarily want to subject my quarter Jew children to the experience I'd had of constantly having to defend my Jewish identity. I wanted my children to be able to understand their Christian heritage, to be educated about and comfortable with Christianity in a way I never had been. I also knew I wanted them to be educated about their Jewish heritage and to have a positive relationship with Judaism. I did not want them to feel that they were trying to pass as Christians, and a more universalist pathway, such as Baha'i or Unitarianism, seemed to ignore the detailed funk and grit of our two family traditions. I wanted to give our children the specificity of our religions and a sense of their place on the family tree. Despite it all, she wanted to communicate her traditions, including her Judaism, even though she was turned away by the larger community of Jews. The real matter, the complex history of assimilation, is whether we're going to take the lessons from Heschel and Schechter and Cohen and welcome Susan in, or continue to shut her out. That is one of the choices that we have as a larger Jewish community. It's my belief that we need to, not just because we have to, but because it's what we have always done. We've always welcomed in the opportunity to make the world work with our Judaism because both of us are necessary to hopefully find and discover all of those sparks of God's goodness that are out there in the world. Shabbat Shalom. Yes, please. So her mom actually, and by the way, this is, I think it's a worthwhile book to have in your library at the very least. Her mom was a religious person. She actually, after Susan had grown up and left the house, she went to seminary. She wasn't so sure about her faith that she was going to necessarily convert. And she definitely wasn't in a space of like, I really need to pass along my tradition to say I really want to also raise her as Christian. And by the way, one of the things that I have also discovered in a lot of my work around interfaithing is that the interfaith dynamic of Jews and Christians really isn't fair. Because to some degree, it's not apples to apples. It's like apples to like oranges or a different kind of fruit, to paraphrase my big fat Greek wedding. It's that Judaism is an ethnicity. It's you could call it a race even. It's a people. It's a sense of culture to the point where you cannot do any of the religious stuff and you feel that sense of Judaism, and that doesn't exist in the same manner in Christianity or in Catholicism. So it's not necessarily easy to really compare the two together, or to say to both a Christian, I want to convert, because for them it's like a belief thing. It's a thing I need to really engage in this. And also for a Jew to say okay, I want them to be a Jew. You don't go to synagogue at all. So why do you want them to be a Jew? I don't get it. So it's also that dynamic that we really need to help families figure out what works for them, because there are so many different kinds of permutations out there. All of them work if it's in the right setting. They don't all work for every family. Some families really want to do both. Some families, you're going to have one primary versus one, we're going to go to their family for the holidays, whatever it might be. Every family has to find its own unique way. But the point here is that the Jewish community turned this one away even though she was a product of much of that positive element of assimilation that we were talking about with the previous three as examples, she was turned away by our community, and we are still doing it. We are still doing it. Not necessarily here, but there are many communities that are still doing it, of turning families away by virtue of not being the right parent, not having the right kind of permutation. How could you be a Jew but also go to church? Like, that doesn't make any sense. All those different reasons don't have a leg to stand on if you look at the larger history of assimilation and Judaism, but it does have a leg to stand on if we just simply think this. If we don't just focus on the Jewish thing, if we don't just do the only thing is Jewish, then we're going to die. If you have that mentality, of course, not going to introduce anything new. But that's not the way Judaism has worked. Yeah.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. I think the takeaway for me is, having a broadened conversation about the breadth of Jewish identity.
Mm-hmm.
And that the metric is not, people who refuse. It's a broader sense of what it means to be Jewish. And, I have three semi-adult children who all are, sort of, I would clearly identify them all as quite Jewish, but they all express it in really different ways.
Yeah.
One likes to take follows, the other one will say, I'm not really Jewish, but sings all the songs.
Yeah.
And the third one will make fill in if someone from the Chabad asks them to.
Yeah, of course.
So, I think that all of those are okay. I don't know who any of them will marry,
Mm-hmm.
but they will bring at least that with them, and however it shows up in their day-to-day life, and it may or may not be about the life people.
Right. And I think it's a really important point about what does it mean to be a part of a larger community, and what does it mean to be a Jew overall. Yeah.
One of the things, you talked about the yes, yes, for people that work together.
Yeah.
Also about the yes, no, and the no yes. But there's also the no and no.
Meaning?
Meaning that they won't give up what they want.
There are,
And that's
well,
very likely.
there are couples out there. I'll tell you my best story of this. So, as a rabbi, you have to hustle for members, which is part of the job. And my last shul there, we had an early childhood center, which is a great program. Get a lot of younger families in, but they don't always stay. So we tried a lot of different kinds of programs to get them to stay. And there's this one particular family, interfaith couple. They were coming to one of our early childhood Shabbat dinners, and I was trying to get them to come and participate. So the guy's Jewish, and his wife was not. And I said, you should come. Welcome everybody. And he's like, no, I'm not that Jewish. You see who I married, right? You see who I married. There are some people who dafka choose a spouse from a different tradition, or somebody who's not like them, as a way of demonstrating that they're not a part of something. But that's relatively rare. That's relatively rare, especially today. Meaning that today is a world in which you do you. I am more than happy for you to be able to express yourself in the way you are. So there's less of a thing to fight back on overall when it comes to it. If somebody is marrying a person of the same faith, there's also a decent chance that they won't really do anything that is Jewish. Ironically, I have found that there are a number of Jews out there who were not very religious, who were not planning on doing things that were religious, because they were married to somebody of a different tradition. And once the kids were born, they're like, oh wow, this thing is important to me. And not necessarily because they thought that was important to them per se, it's because their spouse of the other religion thought it was important to them and wanted to raise their kids in another religion. And that was when the Jew had to be asked, oh my God, am I going to raise a Christian in my own? And sometimes it takes that for our community to be able, or for our people to be like, is this really what I want? And that's okay as well. Everyone goes through their own process. And the point here, the biggest takeaway I'd like you to say is that, I'd like you to take from this, is that our Judaism is so powerful, is so strong, and is so deep that it's not only that it can withstand this, it's that it can take advantage of this opportunity if we let it. If we see it as an opportunity as opposed to seeing it as if the lights go down. And this will be the last thing I say with that, because I started with that Devar Torah for a reason. It's not just that there was a debate about going down or going up. It was a debate about, do we want to assimilate or do we not want to assimilate? Because there were lights happening at that time of year in the Roman calendar, and they were adding more lights from the holiday Saturnalia all the way to the holiday of Indus Invicti, which is a Roman sun god worship that occurs on the 1st of January, which is why you have December 24th all the way to the 1st of January. So the question really was, do we want to be so different than the others that we're going to have our candles go down? Or do we want to be just like the others and have it go up? Do we want to assimilate and have it go up? And the choice that won out, the choice that we do today, is the choice of assimilation, in which it goes up. But here's the kicker. We tell a story about why it goes up that makes that assimilated choice Jewish, which is the light of Hanukkah. The oil lasted for 8 days. It turns this assimilated story, which is centered in this question of, are we going to be like the world around us or are we not? And it brings in the world around us, and it makes that story Jewish. That's what we do so good. We find a way to connect the outside world to something that's in Jewish, and we make it work. And it's awesome. And we do really, really great with that if we're creative, if we're open enough to try new things and see things in different ways. Exactly. There we go. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So, when I was referencing Heschel's program, the third point, to eliminate abuses and derogatory stereotypes by promoting scholarly cooperation, there was also another idea that Gershom Cohen was talking about, not in the same context per se, but about, he was referencing a statement by Achad Ha'am on religious competition. Scholarly cooperation and religious competition could actually be seen as something very similar. Because, and if you read a lot of what Heschel talks about, he's basically saying, what we're doing as Jews, like you Christians should love. Like, if you really are good Christians, you should love what we're doing as Jews because it's amazing. He does talk about what makes Christianity so special, but he doesn't do it to the same extent that he's raising up Judaism. And so I can see a little bit of that sense of, yeah, I think we're right. And that's also a piece of it all, in terms of the extent to which one believes that they are right compared to another. I recognize that there are a lot of different kinds of families out there, There are a lot of different kinds of situations. Each of the families, each person, both with who they decide to marry, if they decide to marry, what they decide to do as a family, each of those choices is so unique and so special and important for it to be true to them. The point is, we can't force it upon others. According to the Talmud, there is one condition by which someone should not be allowed to convert. They should not be allowed to convert for marriage. And yet, according to the way we do Judaism today, the vast majority of people in conversion classes are people about to be married. The reason why you are not supposed to convert for the sake of marriage is because you're supposed to do it for the sake of wanting to convert. And this I will bring up a show that is on, Nobody Wants This, from Netflix, in which, in that issue of converting for the sake of this or that as opposed to do you want it, the way they talk about it shows how ridiculous the question is. Because in the very first season, when she said that she was going to convert, and it was clearly because of who she was dating, that her boyfriend was like, yes, thank God, and you're doing it for yourself, right? This is just for you. You're not doing it for me at all. And at the same time, she's also going through her own search and trying to figure out if this is something that she wants to do. Meanwhile, her mom, who believes in pretty much anything, if it's on a Friday at 2 p.m. and then on a Sunday she believes something else, that she was having a conversation with the boyfriend who told her one of my favorite stories, that according to tradition, every Jew was standing at Mount Sinai, whether they were born, no matter what epoch that they live in, and even if they were Jewish when they were born or not, they were all standing there at Sinai, and then all of a sudden the mom says, I was here. I was there. Later on, her ex-husband is asking, well, was I there? And she's like, I don't think so. So, everyone has their own different path. And by the way, in that story, in that show, the girlfriend really wanted to feel it. But you can be pressured. You can feel like you're being told you're not good enough by virtue of doing that. If it's going to come, it has to happen in the right way. It has to happen, what you say in Hebrew, b'sha'ah tovah, at the right hour. Just as we would say to a pregnant woman, we don't say mazel tov when they're pregnant, because the main job of being pregnant is to have a healthy baby. You say, maybe the baby be born at the right time, b'sha'ah tovah, at the good time, so that they are out there healthy. It could be early, it could be late, it could be on time, it could be whatever it is. But you want it to happen in its due course at the moment that it should.
2 points. Have you seen the book by Rabbi Bachtal?
I am not, no. No, I heard her give a sermon on this topic
It's
before.
the exact story you're talking about with Susan. She comes from a Korean background. Her mother was Korean, her father was Jewish. And she felt that spirit that he conveyed, that Susan was feeling.
Yeah.
And now she's this world,
Yeah.
the most famous rabbi in the country. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's just one point. The other point, however, is, I don't know if you've read the book Anti-Semitism by Fraser.
I've seen it a little bit.
It's everybody should read it. It's about how can there be, it defies all logic if there are any Jews at all left in the world today. Because there has been, since the beginning of time, non-stop anti-Semitism that has tried to destroy the Jews in every country, every society they lived in.
Yeah.
And it was because of their lack of assimilation that kept them together, because it's us against them, and the insular feeling of the importance of maintaining a
is I would love for there to be a Sunday program where Prager and I can argue this